welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have Dr. Elizabeth Weiss. She is a professor of anthropology. She's been working at the San Jose State University, and she's with us to discuss not only her own very interesting work, but some trends in anthropology, in science, the controversies that have led to cancellation of her and people like her at various functions, and why this fraught political environment is affecting things that should be based on strictly research quality, scientific methods, and various objective criteria. Dr. Weiss, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Before we delve into all of this, could you tell us a little bit about what anthropology is? I've taken a couple of courses back in my college days, but many people tend to confuse anthropology and archaeology and don't have a clear idea what the field actually does.
Okay, one of the reasons why anthropology and archaeology get confused is because they mean slightly different things on the different continents. So the US and Europe have slightly different ways of interpreting those two words. But anthropology in the broad sense is the study of humans. And it can be split into basically four components, or four major areas of interest. So there's cultural anthropology, which studies living people, the cultures of living people. And sometimes you'll hear this called socio-cultural anthropology or social anthropology. Some good examples of this would be like Napoleon Chagnon's classic study of the Yanomami in the Brazil in the 60s to 70s, that type of time period, excuse me. Margaret Mead is probably the most famous cultural anthropologist. So that would be another example of cultural anthropologists coming of age in Samoa, and there are big problems with that study, but she is probably the most famous cultural anthropologist. And then, so that's cultural anthropology, studying the cultures of living people. The second part of is physical anthropology, also sometimes called biological anthropology. Physical anthropologists study humans' biology. So that might be the evolution of humans. So those would be like the Leakey family and their research on the different types of early humans that evolved from Africa. And the Neanderthal studies are a good example of physical anthropology. But it also includes studies of prehistoric but human remains, such as prehistoric California Amerindians, which is my area of expertise, or the Paleo Indians, like Kennewick Man, the 9,000-year-old skeleton found in Kennewick, Washington. So sometimes we call those people who study skeletal remains from the archaeological record bioarchaeologists. So they are biological anthropologists, but they're also studying remains from the archaeological record. Archaeologists look at what those people left behind. So stone tools, for example, are the things that archaeologists would look at, whether it's an obsidian arrowhead lodged in someone's bone, or whether it is a mortar and pestle used to grind corn. That is the kind of stuff that archaeologists would examine. You do have historic archaeologists who also consider things like homesteads, for example. Then you have linguistics, which looks at the area, the evolution and origins of language, many times to try to draw connections between the different populations. And there are other subsets within each of these four some people might be saying, well, what about forensic anthropology? Where does that fit in? And forensic anthropology actually fits in with biological anthropology because it is a study of the skeletal remains. And so many people who are anthropologists will actually be looking at more than just one area. So for example, my research, which has spanned now 25 years or so, has included research on Native American, prehistoric Native American remains to try to understand what their lives were like in the past. What were they doing? What did they die of? Things like that. But I've also done research on some of the earliest in our own genus, the genus Homo. So I've looked at arthritis patterns in Homo habilis, the 2 to 3 million year old species that some think we came from. And I've also done forensic work where I looked at growth patterns and how fusion of bones from when you're growing to when you are an adult and cease growing, how we can use X-rays to try to determine the best way to identify those growth lines and when they sometimes mislead us. So I've spanned all three of those biological anthropology fields. And many anthropologists do this, in part because the basis of biological anthropology is twofold. One is evolution, and two is the biological nature of bone. And so that's where they come together.
So one of the biggest controversies, generally speaking, in this field of biological anthropology was this process of evolution, with various people basically claiming that the entire field is fake, especially coming from various religious communities. I'm not entirely sure how they argue, how that argument can be made given the amount of physical evidence concerning certain particular patterns, but how is that argument generally treated by the anthropologists, not the evolutionary biologists who are
Right.
actually sometimes the source of this controversy, but the actual anthropologists who may be the solution?
So anthropologists have been key in bringing evolution into the general education of Americans, of other in England, throughout the world, really, and have also been proponents of not treating certain creation myths as equal to science, saying that if you're going to put in ideas like intelligent design or Christian biblical literalism or Christian fundamentalism, then that is not science and it doesn't belong in the science classroom. And so they have actually been very key proponents, both in the public arena, but also in the courts, to keep science in the science classroom as opposed to letting religion go into the classrooms. Now, there are many anthropologists who are quite religious. So some people don't take literal views of the Bible, for example, or of other religious texts, of course. Some people, have different ways of putting their different thoughts and knowledge together. I'm not religious, so I don't quite understand, but I personally think that if they are, as long as they don't bring religion into the science classroom or into the science lab, then it's irrelevant. So, but I think what's interesting is that although anthropologists have been very active in the battle against bringing religion or allowing religion to come into the classroom of science topics, they have completely done a 180 when it comes to religion that is non-Christian. So I've given talks about this issue before at the Society for American Archaeology, for example. And basically, what we see is that anthropologists who have been very critical, and I would say rightly so, of allowing creation myths from the Bible to be told in classrooms, have had no problem allowing creation myths from Native Americans to be treated like science. And my position is that religious beliefs, everybody should have obviously the right to worship what they believe. I have no problem with that. But I do believe that religious beliefs don't belong in the science lab or in the science classroom. And so it surprised me that anthropologists who have been so good on it, fighting that issue when it came to those from fundamentalist Christians, have really been hypocritical when the same argument can be used with Native American creation myths, which are no less, no more valid than any other creation myths.
So one thing that I am trying to understand here is obviously physical anthropology has been a great tool in historical investigations of societies, of how they lived, and to that effect, they actually have helped provide context for some of the historical discussions in biblical and other religious texts. So how is it? There seems to be some sort of a similarly, one would assume they would provide the same historical context to essentially create paint a picture of the lives of the prehistorical Native American societies. So to that extent, I see that there seems to be any of the creationists on either side, they seem to be engaging in somewhat self-selection of anthropology conveniently being used to prop up the theories and the portions of the text that fit into the discourse, but not so much the timelines and things like that. So how is that general controversy handled? The fact that there is a great deal of self-selection from the alleged critics of anthropological methods?
Well, I think that there is basically there's basically a hypocrisy in the field where anthropologists have decided to treat creation mythology from the Native Americans as science, and they will use terms like oral history, even if it has tales of supernatural things like, water creatures turning into humans. They'll still treat it as some kind of historical tale, historical fact, I would say. Mm-hmm. And a good example of this can be seen when you go to the American Museum of Natural History. The Northwest Coast Hall is the newest remade hall. It opened up a few years ago, I think maybe 2 years ago or so, if I'm not wrong. And what they did was they closed the old hall down. They took 5 years, $19 million, and they recreated the hall, but with consultation with Native peoples, so indigenous peoples from the Northwest Coast. And when they remade the hall, they included all sorts of what I would say are religious beliefs, but they paint them as true fact. So for example, there are plaques at the museum that describe something that obviously cannot have occurred, a supernatural event of a thunderbird coming down from the sky, visiting ancestors to explain how something works, or and And they call it the history, and it's not history, it's mythology, but they've decided to treat it as fact. And it goes further than just kind of telling these stories. They've also decided to follow the Native Americans' religious beliefs in how things are handled, what things should be shown. And so, like, for example, there's a case in the museum that has some masks in it. And on that case, there's a warning sign that these masks are powerful and you should be wary about, you might not want to look at them, and where no photography is allowed. And this is just not true that they are dangerous. But because of the Native American religious beliefs, they've embraced this. Behind the scenes in the curation facility, they have devil's claw hanging above some artifacts to maintain that no spirits escape. This is all religious beliefs. We would not accept it if it was coming from a Christian creationists, but we accept it when it comes from these Native Americans. And I believe that this is a kind of white guilt, anti-Western type of, reason why they're allowing this to, I would say, creep in, but it hasn't even crept in. It's flooded it.
So the first instance of this sort of a kind of historical conspiracy is, of course, the infamous or famous case of the so-called Egyptian pyramid curse, allegedly, affecting the digs and the theft of treasures from the ancient Egyptian pyramids. How does that historical kind of mystery slash conspiracy theory slash myth, how has it laid the foundation for this sort of thing, or is it something entirely separate? And how do these people deal with that particular narrative? Does it extend to that as well, or is it entirely separate case that's generally disregarded?
I think that's a very good comparison. So the ancient Egyptians really believed that you needed to be intact to get to the other side. And they had a complex set of beliefs about the other world. And they had elaborate processes for preserving the body in their mummification processes. And yet looting was done already in the first pharaonic period. So the looting of graves and tombs was a problem throughout ancient Egypt up until really modern times. And the priests of ancient Egypt decided to start to spread curse stories to try to prevent looters, which I think was quite clever. I don't think that they believed those curse stories. I do think it was a deliberate attempt to prevent cursing. But then we get the opening of the tomb of King Tut, right? And then the curse story comes to the West, so to speak. So you have the discovery of King Tut's tomb, the opening, and then there's the conspiracy that half of the people who were there at the opening died shortly afterwards. So researchers have actually looked into whether this happened. And what's the amazing thing is that most of these individuals lived years later, for years longer, and almost all of them died at an age that was older than the average age at the time that they were living in the 1920s, right? So, so in a sense, this should have been like, okay, the curse is broken, right? But nevertheless, it was perpetuated. Now, we teach this, or I've taught this tale in my mummy's class about how this curse started, evolved, and how we now dismiss it. It's interesting that now anthropologists seem to have revived the curse story, not with ancient Egypt this time, but rather with the Native Americans. And we do have like museum curation guides that talk about not allowing supernatural beings escape from artifacts. We shouldn't show certain artifacts because they're too powerful. But also, I think it's interesting that one of the areas of narrative is that the Native Americans, who are oftentimes for repatriation and for reburial of the remains, believe or say they believe that one of the reasons why they have all these ills in their society, the excessive alcoholism, the sad stories of the murdered and missing women, so forth, is because their ancestors haven't been reburied. Well, we know this is not true. And I think that it actually does nobody any favors to just placate them and say, yes, actually, when all the remains are buried, your problems will be solved, because they won't be solved. And then what time was spent trying to solve them through this absurd way could have been spent looking for real solutions.
So this is all fairly mind-boggling, given that we are supposed to be a society who quote unquote believes in science and in experts and so forth. So clearly there are experts who are now making these allegations, people whose authority has been accepted by scientific institutions. So I'm trying to figure out where and how did this trend start? Was there a particular body responsible for driving this new narrative? Is it a political decision? And I'll get to some of the very obvious political things in other areas later, but in terms of anthropology, was there any sort of political initiative that led to this, or is it sort of a grassroots trend that somehow floated and infiltrated everything?
I think it's interesting to look at that historical, birth of this new movement, or so to speak. I think it does have several different parties that came together, but that it is political and has become a legal issue. So one of the groups, of course, are Native American activists, repatriation activists. Some of that is based on desire to get recognition as a tribe. So sometimes this is intertwined with trying for unrecognized tribes, so tribes who are not federally recognized, to become federally recognized, and therefore then have all the benefits of federal recognition, including gambling, right? So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, I believe that there is a group of, groups of Native Americans who truly believe these things, and who have these religious beliefs. I don't think that all of them necessarily do, but I do think that there's that group. Then the concern about the burial of Native American remains and the spiritual health and the physical health of Native Americans was supported by a whole group of other religious communities. The Mennonites, the Baptist Women of America were two, for example, that wrote letters on behalf of Native Americans to pass the federal law, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which passed in 1990. This, I think, set the motion for all of the extremism we see, where religious beliefs and rituals start becoming accepted into the field. So NAGPRA basically allows for creation myths to be used as evidence, but it draws it in a fashion of, you know, in order for a reburial to happen or repatriation to happen, then what you're going to have is you have to have a preponderance of evidence that the remains that they want to rebury are actually related to the modern tribe, what we call affiliated. And you can use all sorts of evidence for that. You can use historic documents, you can use artifacts, you can use genetic, and NAGPRA also allowed oral history and to be used and folklore to be used, which allowed creation myths to come into this story. On top of that, NAGPRA required, and still does, requires that any NAGPRA committee must have two traditional Indian religious leaders in it. So when I wrote Repatriation and Erasing the Past with my co-author, James W. Springer, one of the things we argued, and we had been arguing for a long time, and others have too, is that when NAGPRA required two Native American traditional Indian religious leaders to be on the committee, on the national committees to make decisions, they broke the First Amendment, the separation of church and state, because they basically are establishing or favoring traditional Indian traditional Indian religion or traditional Native American religion, which whatever word you want, phrase you want to use, as opposed to saying, if you wanted somebody who was religious on there but didn't want to break the First Amendment rule of establishment, you would just say a Native American religious leader could be a Catholic, you know, it wouldn't matter. But they specifically define it as it has to be traditional Indian religion. So this allowed that religious aspect to get into anthropology. But then it was followed by other laws like California's reburial laws. And now, of course, we have the Biden administration mandating that Indigenous knowledge is used in all sorts of fields, from the Environmental Protection Act to you know, the CDC. And when you read their 46-page guidelines to using Indigenous knowledge, what you'll find is that they do not have a clear definition of Indigenous knowledge, but what they do is they argue that it's a type of knowledge based on observation, they argue, but also that it's spiritual, that it involves traditional beliefs, that it is, you know, based on spiritual activity and sacredness. So this is not knowledge. This is not comparable, similar to scientific knowledge. This is similar to a religious belief, another religious belief. And so this is going to spread like wildfire in all sorts of agencies. But what you also see in that 46-page guidelines is why they did this. And why the Biden administration did it is the same reason why anthropologists have allowed this to, I would say, pollute our field. And that is that they think that science is Western, and we know science is not Western. Science is universal. It's based on observations that are testable, that can be invalidated, unlike Indigenous knowledge, which they argue cannot be invalidated. But they also argue that science has been a tool for oppression, that by allowing Indigenous knowledge in, they're fighting racism and colonialism. And so it's the old story of the oppressor and oppressed that they're building up again. This entered into the universities in the postmodern era. So postmodern is basically a belief that there is no real truth, that what really matters is who is telling the story. If it's a victim that's telling the story, the oppressed that's telling the story, we need to believe it. And if it's the oppressor, we have to doubt it. And that's where this all comes from, I think.
So to me, I see that there's a commingling of a lot of different interests and narratives into something that, as a result, ends up being extremely muddled and difficult to separate out into what is reasonable and what is not. Allowing for freedom of religion is very reasonable. In fact, it's mandated. But on the other hand, mandating or establishing a religion, which is what the US government seems to be doing now, is not, even if they're choosing to redefine science as a religion, is potentially violating the First Amendment. However, let's get back to the very basic of all of this from a legal perspective. The use of these expert spiritual leaders and the use of these oral histories as evidence. Now, as a lawyer, it's very clear to me that it's quite common and very necessary to use certain types of religious traditions to advance as evidence in courts to explain why particular violations of freedom of religions are violations, what practices are used by these individuals, so in that are being violated. So that sort of explanation is part and parcel of the legal process. So to me, that seems perfect. That part seems perfectly reasonable. What is not reasonable is then commingling the evidence to establish what a particular group believes about itself and its heritage, and then commingle it with the separate historical, anthropological, physical evidence, and certainly to accept it as an evidence of history rather than of what that group believes about itself, its group identity. This is, I think, where we are running into a problem.
And I think that part of the problem revolves around the fact that Native Americans never had written language. And so they have no sacred texts to use as evidence to say, okay, you're saying that. So for example, one of the Native tribes, one of the groups that in California, and from the area that I am, the San Francisco Bay area, has claimed that marijuana was used spiritually by their ancestors. Well, this must have then come up after the Europeans arrived, because marijuana was introduced to the New World by Europeans. Marijuana wasn't in the New World prior. So in a sense, they're claiming that this is an ancient practice that from time immemorial, when we know this is not the case. And so I think that we can see that sometimes some people will use the cloak of religion to make an argument and saying, well, it's my religion. And I think that when we're looking at freedom of religion cases, usually you would have something to check. You would have the Bible, you would have the Quran, you would have the Talmud, right? But in Native Americans' cases, they have no written texts, no written sacred texts or non-sacred texts, because they didn't develop written language. And so it makes it very difficult to determine what is their religion, genuine religion or not. There's a difference between a personal preference and a religious belief. But I also think that when we're looking at cases, one of the issues is, when we're making a scientific, when we're trying to determine something for science's sake, like whether we should be able to study 10,000-year-old skeletal remains, then scientific evidence and historical evidence should be used. If we're trying to argue that somebody's religious freedoms have been violated, then we need to use the sacred texts. And I think that NAGPRA treats it the other way around. It's just like, I started off this show saying that, we shouldn't let religion into the science classroom. And I would argue that if I go to a church now, let's say somebody invites me to come to their church, I would be respectful and I wouldn't like stand up and say, well, this is wrong, Of course not, because in the church, that's where the religion, of course, should take precedent. So I do think that there are separate spaces, and I do think that that those need to be respected on both sides.
So there is another element that is highly problematic from a cultural and social perspective that I'm not sure the US government is even aware that it was doing. When you stated that they mandated the inclusion of 2 Native American religious leaders, did they specify what background those leaders had to be from? Because my understanding is, especially in the context of what you just told me, that there's likely more than one religious practice among the various diverse Native American tribes, of which there's well over 100 in the United States. So how do they determine which of these, variety of religious traditions are the ones who, who get relegated to that commission? And doesn't it lead to conflicts among these various tribes?
Yeah, they are appointed, and I've never seen that issue addressed. And I think that they basically have been appointed, and it's very difficult to assess the differences between the different Native American religions in a sense, because there's no written text. We can't, it's difficult for that reason. They all have a sort of animism. So all of the Native American religions that I have read about from cultural anthropologists, especially the early cultural anthropologists who are interviewing Native Americans, so in the 40s, 50s, 60s, right? Maybe even some in the 30s, but maybe mainly 40s, 50s, and 60s in the US. They found that there's a lot of overlap in the sense that they all have kind of a creation myth that has some supernatural creator, but that there's a lot of tales of talking animals, things like that, thunder gods, thunderbirds, and it's a type of animism. But there's variation in the details, the devil's in the details, so to speak, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I haven't actually seen how that NAGPRA or any of the committees, like the California committees, have dealt with that. And one of the interesting things is that we kind of think of Native Americans as all one group, but when you look at when you take a detailed look in any one region, there are, of course, various tribes or tribelets. They've changed over time. Their quote unquote religious beliefs have changed over time. They fight amongst one another about who is the true descendant. So it's not a clear picture at all. For example, like in the Bay Area, there's several tribes that are literally familial relatedness. So like cousins and second cousins, right? Who disagree about their tribal name, about the validity of the different tribes, and this is just in a family. So it is such a complicated complicated issue, social issue, cultural issue, that it should not be able to basically hamstring the ability for archaeologists and anthropologists to study the past while they fight amongst each other. But what happens is whenever there's a dispute, everything gets put on hold and nothing can be done. So it's it is a very tricky situation.
That is quite astounding, but that brings me to the practical implication of the US federal government wading into the weeds of these internal disputes and the attempt to arbitrate between science and religion, in the sense of, meddling very much into the business of private museums that are partially federally funded, and forcing them to adopt these narratives, and then establishing pseudo-scientific consensus based entirely on the testimonies of these various representatives who themselves are not in agreement on this topic as part of official policies, FDA, medical school curriculum in some cases, and so forth. Now, the implications of this are quite problematic. If a medical student or a scientist is required to proceed with their understanding of their practice in a particular way and to administer medicine based on best available information, and then you are mandated to take into account these separate spiritual practices, can you and you don't have clear evidence that these practices have any health benefit or are not in fact harmful, can you in good faith practice medicine or rule as an FDA on the efficacy of particular treatments and so forth? How do these legal and fiduciary duties of the profession clash with these political initiatives and laws?
Well, I think that that's a very good question. And basically, with Biden's mandate to include Indigenous knowledge, this is going to affect, of course, medicine, the CDC, the NIH, but at every level. So which studies get funded? So in a sense, it will balloon the costs of studies because you'll have to, let's say you want to study something, let's say you want to look at arthritis and you want to see what is the best way to treat arthritic pain, then you have to then also include Indigenous knowledge now. So you have to then hire a person who will, Indigenous people to get this knowledge. They will tell you what they think. You'll have to figure out how to include that in your research. And of course, you will have to pay them. One of the interesting things that I find whenever I go to any meeting on the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, Indigenous knowledge, is that there's always a don't ask us to do anything for free, right? So there's always a point comes in the discussion that they will be paid. And that's fine in the sense if that's what is needed, but this is not needed. This is a waste of money, but also it's going to weaken our ability to draw strong conclusions. We have to put hypotheses in there that include various religious beliefs, and it will take time. It will make things longer. The other thing I've learned, regardless of what issue you're looking at with Native American activists, whether they're repatriation activists or whether they're Indigenous knowledge activists, is that they say, you need to give us time to quote unquote build trust, time to make our decisions, time. And so this is going to slow things down. The other thing is you might have to consult many tribes. So one of the things I learned recently is one of the anthropologists at the Smithsonian has said that he's no longer interested in working on Native American remains, because the last time he tried, they gave the the museum said that he had to consult with 27 tribes for one study on skeletal remains. So he said, this would be tie me up for years. So you're going to see it tie people up for years. And medical doctors who are studying are going to be taking classes that are useless. This will increase the cost of their education. And we know where these costs will end up coming from. They come from the taxpayers. And so I do think that in a way, it's going to increase many costs. And it's going to waste much time from getting your research funded to consulting to making the study. And sometimes it will even result in, well, we don't like your conclusions and therefore we don't want you to publish. And that's another fear. And people might say, oh, well, that would not happen with medicine, but it might. The Havasupai of the Grand Canyon region actually sued University, I believe it was University of Arizona or Arizona State University. It was one of the two, anthropologists and geneticists, because the Native American tribal members agreed to give their blood for genetic testing. They signed consent forms. Those consent forms have said that the research would include research on diabetes and certain other health issues, I can't remember. But it also said that it would be that other research areas of interest might also be using the data, such as the peopling of the Americas, the genetics of schizophrenia, and so forth. Well, when the research was being conducted and the write-ups were occurring that suggested that the Havasupai maybe didn't maybe weren't always in the group from the Grand Canyon, but migrated from somewhere, coupled with that inbreeding levels were high, and that this might help explain, there's some genetic component to schizophrenia, and so this might help explain some schizophrenia rates. They pulled the plug. They sued the university, and they said, we did not agree to this, and some of that research has not been published. We know of it because of the court case. And basically, the university ended up settling and paying. So this is a road we should not be going down, but it looks like that's a road we are going down. Couple that with the fact that in Biden's mandate and guidelines, they acknowledge that Native American indigenous or Native American knowledge or indigenous knowledge sometimes needs to be kept secret. And so they're looking at ways to let the quote unquote knowledge holders tell you what part they want to tell you, omit anything that they don't want to tell you. You still have to believe what they told you. And basically, it should be redacted in Freedom of Information Act requests. So if something goes wrong in a medical study that used indigenous knowledge, how would we figure it out if we can't get the information? This is definitely an area that medical researchers and doctors should be concerned with.
Now, all of that is problematic enough, but let's get back to the anthropology aspect and the issue of museums that you brought up, which seems to be, while having less direct, life-threatening implications, still seems to be potentially quite problematic. So
Yes.
one of the recent developments is the mandate that the federally funded museums that have to completely redo all their Native American exhibits. Are there a specific guideline that they're supposed to follow, and what exactly are they supposed to be doing?
So some of the changes revolve around the quote unquote final rule of NAGPRA. We know this is not going to be final rule, but that's the latest rule. And these changes, these regulatory changes to NAGPRA, they wouldn't call them changes, they would call them clarifications. But I think that it is definitely change. Include things like giving deference to Native American evidence. So if a scientist and a Native American disagree, that the Native American who is being consulted would be given deference. Now, of course, you can have a Native American scientist, but they're separating that, they're separating out basically the knowledge holders, or who they will call knowledge holders, elders, or spiritual leaders, as the people who are being deferred to. They're considered expert witnesses, and what they say is to be taken as true. So that's one aspect. So it's no longer really as much as it was before a preponderance of evidence. It's more leaning towards a way of, if there's a disagreement, we go with the Native American knowledge that has been told, and that's that. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that museums now have to get approval to display artifacts and human remains. Most museums have just decided we're not going to display human remains. I think this is very problematic. The museums spark the imagination. They are what, when you go on a field trip in school and, you see something that you wouldn't have seen just in a store, just in walking by something that like triggers something in the child's mind that says, wow, this is interesting. A plastic skeleton does not do that like a real skeleton. The details are completely incomparable. And, some people might walk by a cast and say, oh, can't tell if that's a real one or not. But some people will say, yes, this is definitely a difference between the cast and the real one. And if you're a child who can tell that difference, maybe then you should go into a field that requires that, knowing that level of detail, being able to observe that level of detail. So I think we're doing the next generation harm by not allowing them to see things in museums that are truly amazing and special. And human remains, real human remains, fall under that category in my mind. But the other thing is that they will be able to control the narrative of what is being displayed. And this falls under, in NAGPRA, basically, because you have to consult with the Native Americans in order to say what's going to be shown. They're going to decide, okay, you want to show this? Well, no or yes. Or we'll show it if you explain it this way in our fictional tale. They wouldn't say that, of course, but with our mythology attached. And that's where you see those things like the supernatural, the warning about the masks, because they are telling that narrative. The knowledge holders, the elders, the spiritual leaders. The other aspect of this is that there's going to be massive repatriation. Skeletal collections, artifacts, are going to be repatriated and just leave our great museums empty of collections. And those collections are used in multiple ways. One way, of course, to display and spark wonder and curiosity. But museums, the great museums, have curation facilities with collections in the back for researchers. And some people may think, well, you know, does research on skeletal remains of the past people really have an impact? And it does. That's how we get, that's how we build forensic anthropology. Forensic anthropologists usually start out as people who are studying the skeletal remains of people who died in the past. And then we say, wow, there's these correlations, these similarities across different cultures that can help us determine who was a male or females, for example. So I think that it's twofold there. The other aspect of this is that there will be a lot more money spent on this repatriation as opposed to on new collections, on upkeep, and so forth. So I think this is going to have devastating consequences for the field and for museums in general.
So how does that ultimately help Native Americans if fewer people are able to learn about them or nothing at all, you know?
I think that they are, they would argue that, and I'm saying they in terms of the Native American repatriation activists. Let me add a little caveat in here. I get emails from Native Americans all the time who are just as upset about this as I am, who don't want to have fake stories told about them through religious, for religious purposes. So I don't know of any tribe who would support my statement, but I do get emails from Native Americans who are not for these steps. But the tribes have decided that they don't want things that contradict their religious supernatural stories to be told. And so part of that is they don't want contradictions such as, you know, actually you came over from Siberia or from, you know, Mongolia 20,000 years ago, or, well, you know, in this area of time, there wasn't peace for millennia as your oral history supposedly says, but you guys were fighting. We see the injuries, you know, arrowheads stuck into pelvic bones. They don't want their narrative of the peaceful, environmentally friendly Native Americans challenged, I would say. So I suspect there will be a lot more also about how they were stewards of the land, they, you know, ignoring facts like, you know, there were some times when they killed far more animals than they could eat. And one of the reasons is that some Native American tribes believed that animals regenerated. So when you killed one, it would be regenerated by the creator, and therefore you never had to worry about overhunting. All peoples had absurd beliefs. And so the difference is now in American anthropology, we're treating absurd beliefs from one group of people, the Native Americans, as fact, and we're not challenging these. This is very problematic.
And I think what you said, the fact that there are individual voices and diverse voices that want something else, the fact that they're not even entering the conversation, much less being included in the dialogue, and as despite the fact that they're also stakeholders in all of this, I think it is equally problematic from any perspective.
I absolutely agree, and I would say, you know, people have accused me of saying, oh, I won't work with Native Americans. That's not true. I'll work with anybody who puts science at the forefront. That's my perspective. If I'm conducting research, I want somebody who wants to try to figure out what actually happened. what was the past like? And so if people want to engage in that type of research with me, I am happy to work with them, whether they're European, Hispanic, Native American, African, it doesn't matter to me. And we shouldn't be, we shouldn't act like, well, you know, all Native Americans agree with this because the tribes do. Now, interestingly, in the last round of NAGPRA changes, all the tribes who gave comments, which were, you know, there were hundreds of comments, and there was oral testimony. I think I went through like almost 200 comments. I went through all the written comments. I watched all the videos that were up on the NAGPRA thing, and there was not a single tribe that said, hold on, let's not go this far. They all wanted more repatriation, not less. And of course, these are the tribal elders who are speaking, the tribal leaders who are speaking, the tribal spiritual leaders who are speaking. They're ignoring some of the voices who are truly interested in science.
So what happened when you tried to bring up these concerns in your talk that you mentioned earlier on?
So that my Society for American Archaeology talk, and this was in, I believe, 2020, but maybe 2021. It's been a while now. I was basically, it was on Zoom because of COVID restrictions. Mm-hmm. And so how the organization did their conference was that it was definitely 2021, but they recorded the talk, and then on the conference days, they played the talk with a sidebar of people could ask questions, put comments, and one of the authors had to be at the original playing of the talk, and then they would leave the talk up for 3 months, right? Mm-hmm. So right before the talk aired, there was a flurry of activity trying to get the organizers to not show the talk. They were saying it's racist, anti-Indigenous, and my argument was actually quite, what I would think, quite simple and not even controversial from my perspective, was that basically, since we don't allow other creation myths to be used as evidence in anthropology and archaeology, we shouldn't allow Native American creation myths to be used as evidence. That, not saying that we shouldn't allow their oral history if it doesn't have creation and myths and supernatural stories told in it, but that we shouldn't allow their religious aspects. And so I gave that talk. It was aired, and the sidebar quickly filled up with insults instead of questions. I tried to answer every question that I got. There were like 3 or 4 that I did answer, but it was interesting because as people were just like saying, you know, this is racist garbage, they were like, you know, where's the author? She's supposed to be here. I'm like, I'm here. If you have a question, I will answer it. You know, like, I'm not going to respond to every time somebody calls me a racist, right? So, but the thing was that after that talk, they pulled it. After it aired the one time, they pulled it, and they would not put it back up. The organization apologized for allowing it in, and they rewrote their rules on accepting accepting talks to prevent this type of thing from happening again. Basically preventing any debate over how repatriation should occur or not. So that's what ended up happening. A few years later, I think in 2023, maybe 2022, if I'm not, I submitted another abstract to the Society for American Archaeology. asking a very simple question. The abstract revolved around the expanding definition of, or the expanding usage of the word sacred to define other things that are not sacred. So for example, if you look at NAGPRA, the definition of sacred is that basically it would need to have been used in traditional Indian religious practices. So if something can be shown to have been needed for those traditional practices, then it's sacred. And yet the tribe in California who took a stand against my work and my position on repatriation, all of a sudden claimed that X-rays are sacred. Well, X-rays cannot be sacred because there would be no way that Native Americans used X-rays in any of their religious traditions. They didn't have X-rays. There are no current practices that require X-rays. So it's just a lie. And so one of the things I put in my abstract was, how do we deal with these kinds of issues? And if X-rays are to be redefined as human remains, maybe, or which I think is problematic, just as problematic, then what about X-rays that are scanned, for example, digital X-rays? What about X-rays? So for example, my university has a set of X-rays that they won't let me access. But throughout the years, many people have X-rayed skeletal remains from, my university and others, and they have their X-rays at home, or they have their X-rays on the computer. So are they not allowed to use them either? Right? So that's, so that was my, and actually I phrased the abstract as, how do we get to a point where we can kind of agree what boundaries there are and deal with what's held at the university and what's held privately, what is the mechanism for making decisions? And so it was asking that question, not answering it, but asking it, which I made clear in the abstract. And they basically said, we do not, they rejected it. They said that they're not going to allow any questions about whether something shouldn't be repatriated, basically.
Well,
everything, and it's an everything back movement. So when NAGPRA was first passed, they thought, okay, we have these guidelines: human remains, sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony, which are like objects owned by a whole group of people, not a single individual, and funerary objects. That was it. And that these materials and remains must be linked to a modern tribe. So that was NAGPRA. Now, the definition of sacred is in limbo, I would say. Every artifact can now be relabeled as sacred from any time, especially since there are no written texts, and you cannot challenge what the Native American elder or spiritual leader says, because they're given deference. So let's say you have a set of artifacts, like a set of arrowheads. You say, okay, I had the tribe come in, consult, and they said everything's fine, you can display those. Next year, there's a tribal change or whatever, and the new person says, oh, no, those are sacred, you can't display those. You have no way of saying, well, actually, last year, they were determined non-sacred, because the new person is given deference, and there's no sacred text for comparison. This is a recipe for disaster.
So the question is, why is a scientific body, why is this association, out of is it overabundance of caution? Is it some sort of a, is it just some sort of a preponderance of ideological interests on board? Why are they going far beyond the strict language of these rules and actually giving even less room for discussion and raising questions? If not, raising questions is not being
It's not allowed.
anti-differential. It's just a question of defining the terms and understanding the rules. So it seems to me that they're going far beyond what is necessary to abide by the rules and into an area which doesn't even allow the understanding of what those rules are to begin with. So where is
Yes.
that coming from? What's behind it?
I think that's coming from postmodernism again, where the reason why they are saying I cannot challenge anything is because the Native Americans are treated as the oppressed and I am the oppressor. So that's part of it. Guilt from the past, anthropologists past. So every field has done some bad things and good things, right? So anthropologists had, there were anthropologists who engaged in grave robbing, but there were also anthropologists who testified for the Civil Rights Act. Like you can't say, oh, well, we have to pay for the sins of these people from the past, constantly paying for them. There were Native Americans who did great things, and there were Native Americans who did bad things. That's just life, right? And so you could look at any area and find that. But I do think it's partly this postmodernism, oppressed oppressor. Part of it is guilt for the past. But also, I think it's about the tribes. And in this time, I'm using the term tribes more generally. What surprised me is that it wasn't only the Native American researchers who were researching Native American remains, but it was people who, from Europe, who were looking at, Bronze Age Europeans who also were against me having this ability to challenge these perspectives of creationism in the field and repatriation in general. And I think that when I say these tribes, I'm talking about the tribes like the Black Trowel Movement, which is a group of archaeologists who kind of embraced pseudo-Marxism. And so they're focused on the oppressed and the oppressor. There's a queer anthropology interest group, which are they see themselves as oppressed, and so they're supporting another oppressed group, and I'm the oppressor. There's the Trans Doe Foundation that argues that forensic anthropologists keep misidentifying individuals who are deceased because those individuals, or misgendering or missexing those individuals who were trans.
How
So
would they even make that determination, by the way?
For forensics, it's even for forensic cases, so like we're talking modern cases, it's extremely difficult because basically the skeleton is very much, very clearly different for men and women, from the head to the toe, so to speak. Of course, the majority of the differences are in the pelvis, but the skull has differences, the arm bones, how muscles attachments affect the bone. So these are systemic differences. There are, when men undergo facial feminization surgery, like literally plastic surgery to make them look more feminine, they've done some studies to see whether they could identify them as women or at least as men who had undergone the surgery. And the changes, the surgery that changed bone, still the changes were too too minor to actually erase the fact that they were men. So it is very difficult. Maybe they will get there and be able to see whether somebody had medical intervention to become a trans person of the opposite sex as their biological sex. I don't think you can change your sex. So it's always a word,
This is what I don't
tongue
understand.
twister. But
You know, I mean, obviously, there's the question of identity, whatever. There may be accounts of
right,
somebody naming themselves whatever and engaging in fashion. That's fine.
yes,
But then there's a question of biological sex, and I don't think, you know, however you want to identify with and what lifestyle you want to have and what surgeries you want to undertake, the history of forensic evidence has nothing to do with these social issues and issues of
right,
identity. They're all about studying skeletons and frankly, those people are dead, so it's not like we can ask their opinions on
yeah.
how they would have identified themselves had they been present. So how do these activists even make that argument, given that the question of all these trans issues are all about accepting somebody's identity and not necessarily, you know.
Yeah, it gets very it gets very esoteric, I guess. It would be a kind word to say. Basically, those are people who are interested in queer archaeology, so moving away from forensics, but literally ancient people. What they do is they basically oftentimes argue that when you find a skeleton that has artifacts that are different from what their bones say, they were more likely to be trans or queer, or and the thing is that this artifacts, the skeleton should be what we call the independent variable, right? It does not change. It's independent of the artifacts. The artifacts themselves are dependent. So in some cultures, people are buried with artifacts that match males and females have different artifacts. But in other cultures, males and females don't have different artifacts buried with them. In some cultures, a needle is a female artifact, and in some cultures it's a male artifact. This proves nothing about trans, and it's kind of insulting that they would think that you can determine whether somebody was trans based on what artifacts they were buried with. But that's basically the main way they look at it. So I think that needle example is a very good example, because one of the things we find is that, around the world, sewing is done by women in some cases and by men in others. In our own culture, we have seamstresses and tailors. So why would we think that anytime you find a needle with a male, that might have been a trans? It's absurd.
It's
But those are
very
the types of
bizarre.
arguments we hear.
That is a very bizarre argument. And by the way, looking at historical accounts of ancient societies, while it's possible that there were some individuals who were trans, and in some cases, I don't know, bisexuality was a common cultural practice, making the argument that, most skeletons would be anything other than their, biological sex, and that they would even identify as anything other than who they appear to be, seems very, very strange. It's a lot of this.
Especially since we know that this trend is very recent. I mean, when I started out at San Jose in 2004, San Jose State University in 2004, we had no trans students that I was aware of. By the time I left, there was not a single class where I didn't have at least one student who was trans or non-binary. And so my classes weren't huge. They were like 20 or 30 students. So you have to think that that's like, if it's, that's like 5%.
And by the way, the way people would, for instance, cross-dress into another culture could have had reasons other than identification that's not consistent with their
Right.
self-perception. It could be
I mean,
other reasons for why people would dress as the opposite sex. Anything from costumes to desire to fight in the military to trying to escape to or hide from something,
yeah,
or
sure. And the other thing is that fashion changes, right? So in a sense, we wouldn't, people might say, oh, well, men don't wear skirts. Well, Scottish men sometimes do, right? Or women, why would a woman be wearing pants? Well, it's quite common now. So, fashion does change, colors change. I don't know how true this is, but I've heard before that pinks and purples used to be more associated with men
very
than
much
women.
so prior to the beginning of the 20th century, approximately.
So, if you look at marriage customs in certain Asian cultures, the wedding dress is red, and here it's white. I mean, I think that these kinds of things are interesting, but they show cultural changes that are interesting and fun to look at, but they do not prove anything about the trans issue, about how many people identified as a different sex. So I do think, but I do think that all of these different tribes, whether it is a queer archaeology group or the Black Trowel movement, they all see that, okay, we have to support the oppressed, in their view, the Native Americans, against the oppressor, which they view as me or other Western scientists. And therefore, it's about all the tribes. And it started with this postmodern movement of there is no truth. There's only oppressed and oppressor, and we got to listen to the oppressed. It's not that different from like the Me Too movement, which kind of fell by the wayside because of the Black Lives Matter movement. But if you think about it, what was the line of the Me Too movement? Believe every woman. Now that has also fallen away wayside because of the problems in the Middle East now.
It would be nice if somebody said believe evidence.
Right. So in a sense, that is just another one of those things, because a woman is seen as the oppressed and the male the oppressor. So you have to believe every woman.
But
and so I do think it's
this is where it gets very interesting, because the intersectional activists should be curious about how to treat issues internal to the tribal context, because first of all, there was oppression within tribes among different members, and second, among tribes, there were tribes that oppressed each other at various points in time, and sometimes those roles change. So how does that narrative fit into that context?
Well, that's a very interesting point, because we do know that certain tribes engaged in slavery. We do know, so in some of the southeast tribes engaged in slavery prior to Europeans' arrival, right? The Northwest Coast as well. We do know that some tribes had very much hierarchies within them, and that some tribes saw other tribes as less than human. So there was all this conflict, and if you look at certain collections, there's lots of evidence of violence and invasions. They don't want this story to be told, and so one of the reasons that Native American activists are eager to repatriate remains is so that their narrative of being peaceful, egalitarian, is not revealed as a lie. And anthropologists will say, well, yeah, we know this. Of course we know that they fought and so forth. But when it comes to actually putting that information out, many anthropologists have backed away from it. I saw a talk by quite a well-known anthropologist who did research on violence in prehistoric populations of the Americas. His stuff was great when I loved reading his stuff. It was interesting. It's just fantastic. And now he doesn't do that because he says, he couldn't live with the guilt of revealing this stuff. He can sleep better now, but so he can't get anything worthwhile published. And he's now in a community college as opposed to his university, but at least he can sleep better now. So
That's unbelievable.
he has put these sensitivities ahead of the science, and he knows the truth, but he doesn't want to tell it anymore.
That is unbelievable because it's a huge disservice to the Native Americans first and foremost, not,
Yes.
creating these simplistic victimhood narratives as opposed to understanding how these societies evolved, how they interacted internally and with the outside world, where, it's disempowering because it's
It is
disempowering.
disempowering.
It is disempowering because at various points people did have power. Sometimes they used it for the good, and sometimes they used it for the not good, so good. But the fact that they had it at all, I think it's important to to having a healthy sense of identity. And the fact that this is being taken away by the so-called good wishes right now is frightening.
Yes. And some people would say, well, how would it feel if it was your people that were being told this narrative, that we were telling this narrative about? Now, I don't have a deep knowledge of my ancestry going back not decades, but millennia, right? But my mother's German, and my father's side his mother's side was Austrian Jewish, and his father's side was Romanian Jewish. So I'm European, right? But if we look at my mother's side, the German side, if you look at the Germanic tribes of the Bronze Age, so these are the bog bodies, there's plenty of bad stuff that has been said and written about them, about how they, one thing is that they seem to have only been wearing basically animal hide as clothing. They were quite primitive in that way. They engaged in a lot of violence. We do know like that they had been fighting between each other. They threw bodies in the bog that might have been sacrifices sometimes, but it might have also been sometimes belief in witches. We're not 100% sure. There's still research being done on that, which is interesting. It doesn't offend me, the Romans came and they, made things better. They were more civilized, right? So in a way that, the 3,000 to 5,000 year old Europeans who were, fighting each other, throwing each other in bogs and so forth. It's amazing that we've come so far. It's fascinating that we started there and came so far. It's not insulting to look at progress. It's empowering.
And quite frankly, if you don't learn from the things that were not so great, you are very likely, to create this, these myths, unfortunately, of group myths devoid of self-criticism and self-awareness of one's history has allowed horrific atrocities by both Western and non-Western emperors and groups and dictators to take place, precisely using mythologies devoid of any critical evaluation of things that people would be loath to imitate. So
yes,
that's
absolutely. Whether it's the horrors of the Holocaust, which relatives of mine died during the Holocaust era, in the Holocaust, or the Stalin gulags. I mean, we have to face the fact that there were horrible things that happened. It doesn't mean that we need to feel guilty for that. It just means that we need to learn from it.
Absolutely. And hopefully, I'm hoping that having more open and honest discussions, not, in the sense of trying to attack the other side, but trying to understand where, these issues are leading in their ultimate conclusion, if you take them far enough, will help course correct to something more reasonable. I'm all for including experts that may have some additional perspective that will help scientists study societies. I think that's a valuable tool. Where we go wrong is we completely throw out the baby with bathwater and disregard any scientific process in order to assuage someone's personal feelings. That, I think, is the problem.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully, instead of canceling, we will actually, provide positive content and provide positive ways of discussing issues and providing different perspectives and bringing diverse voices and helping people gain, deeper awareness that will lead to better results, better conclusions. I think the way to fight any sort of prejudice is more discussion, more conversation, not cancellations and censorship.
Yes. And if people want to know more, I do my Twitter has my website link, and my Twitter account is at Weiss Unburied. I also, of course, had my book Repatriation and Erasing the Past come out in 2020, and my new book should come out in July, mid-July, and that's On the Warpath: My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors.
I think both sound fascinating, and I hope
Great.
that people watching this program will want to learn more and fascinated by all these historical and social and legal battles and actually try to learn and read and inform, even if they disagree. At least they will look at different perspectives and not just form opinions based on hearsay and insults and emotional outrage. If you want to be
Absolutely.
outraged, at least have a basis for it.
Right, right. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
talking to me.
Thank you so much. And for everyone watching the program, we'll be back as usual Tuesday night, 9 p.m., the Washington Outsider Report. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great evening.